Well, for some expert insight into beach nourishment as a way to fight erosion, Sweta Chakraborty joins us now live from New York City. She's a risk and behavioral scientist. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So our reporter raised an interesting question. Should Miami and other coastal areas be spending this type of money to bring in more sand versus investing in other longer-term solutions?
So really the best way to think about this, Rochelle, is that we are putting a Band-Aid on an open gun wound. We are bringing in 61,000 tons of sand to fill in holes and to just make the coastline look more attractive for those who are planning to retire to the pristine beaches of Florida, for tourists who are so attracted to the beauty that is this coastline. And that's all great, but we cannot be making decisions based on wishful thinking when the science knows that this part of the country is going to be submerged by the end of the century. All signs point to that. Barrier islands generally across the globe are suffering because they're vulnerable to sea level rise, because they're vulnerable to flooding and storm surges that come with all of these impacts of climate change. So we really need to think critically of what we're going to do about the 800 million plus people that are really vulnerable to these impacts.
So then have we seen much innovation in this space in terms of solutions?
There have been a lot of efforts made to make coastlines more resilient. There's been efforts made to fortify existing infrastructure. But ultimately, what needs to happen is proactive managed retreat for those who are susceptible to the worst case impacts. And we've seen some places that really got it early on. Places like the Netherlands, for example. They are notoriously low-lying. And early on, they commissioned an engineering project called the Rotterdam Gates that was put out into the seabed to protect the city from incoming sea level rise, from storm surges. Ultimately, what they realized was that the gates weren't actually high enough. And that's what scientists and those in policy fear will happen and be replicated elsewhere, is that we won't actually be protecting ourselves for the worst case scenarios, that we'll just continue to be doing those little Band-Aid moves at worst case, doing what we're seeing in Miami, which is refortifying the beaches, but at worst case, putting in hundreds of millions of dollars into some of these engineering projects that just won't protect us to the extent that we'll need.
And we are seeing some people saying, look, we keep re-nourishing these beaches, we get more tourists, we get more tourism money. But what sort of long-term economic domino effects come with rising sea levels?
And that's exactly right, because those who can afford to live along the coastlines, despite the vulnerability that we anticipate, that's okay in the United States, in some parts of the United States. But there's communities all over the world that don't have the luxury of being able to continue to have that view and have that vantage point and attract tourism. I'm talking about places like Mumbai in India, Calcutta, where my family's from, that is at great risk of sea level rise. Places like Shanghai in China, these are places that aren't necessarily going to see any economic gain really from protecting and allowing that tourism to continue, but ultimately will result in significant losses if proactive management isn't put into place, especially those cities that are critical financial centers throughout the world. We saw what happened in New York City after Hurricane Sandy a few years back. That's the kind of thing that ultimately we know we can anticipate is going to increase in frequency and intensity, and therefore, if we're not going to put in the investment we need early on, we're going to result in much more economic losses in the future. Those are key areas we cannot afford to lose.
And we certainly did see some huge economic losses, as you mentioned, with Hurricane Katrina. So then what sort of funding is being put towards solving the problem versus reacting to it?
Well, that's exactly where we are imploring governments to put more upfront, even though that might not be what is politically attractive, because ultimately, sea level rise you have to take a view on it. It is something that is slow-moving. It's far in the future. Not for places like Florida. In Florida, even on sunny days, there is flooding, what is referred to as nuisance flooding, because there's a limestone underbed and because of sea level rise, which has gone up on average a foot. And that's significantly impacting Florida. It's obvious places like there. You have fish swimming across the streets in Florida. And so other parts of the country in the United States, it's not quite as obvious. So it's still very much a problem that governments and policymakers need to contend with, is how do you convince constituents that this is a problem that, even though it's not directly impacting them at the moment, it's something that taxpayer dollars need to look into now to prevent against the connected centers that we are not disassociated from. What happens in Miami, what happens in New York City, what happens in Shanghai, what happens in Mumbai are all going to cause a collective global impact. So there is that perception barrier to overcome, and then we need confident leadership to make those investments, even though that they might not be popular immediately, they will serve us collectively much better long term.
Always good to have you, Sweta Chakraborty there.